Hello all, and welcome to the August Patch Tuesday webcast. We'll begin in just a few short moments, but before we do, I'd like to remind all attendees they are currently in listen-only mode. But please feel free to ask questions of the panelists at any time. We're going to hold those questions and answer them during the live Q&A session at the end. With that, I'd like to hand it over to Rob Brown.
Thank you, Heidi. A warm welcome to everyone joining us today on another Patch Tuesday. I've invited two experts from our team as usual. Maybe guys, you'd like to introduce yourself, John?
Yep, thanks, Rob. John Cassell, Solutions Architect with Syxsense, based in Southern California. Been working in IT for quite a few years and desktop and server operations. And at Syxsense, I dabble in pre-sales, customer onboarding, and training.
That's lovely. Thank you, John. And Pete, please.
Yeah, no problem. Hi, everybody. My name is Pete. I've worked for Syxsense as a pre-sales consultant for 5 years. Prior to my current role, I worked for an oil company where I managed a tool that at the time was called Landesk. The tool was used to manage around 4,500 devices. I used the tool for general asset management, software deployment, and of course, patch management.
Thank you, Pete. And hello again. My name is Rob Brown. I'm the Director of Services from our UK head office, currently still working from home. My team are responsible for the delivery of security solutions, one of those being patch management. And yeah, we've deployed over 100 million patches in the last 15 or so years. So welcome everyone for joining. So I want to give some feedback. We've had some marvelous feedback. We had more feedback on after the last webcast than we ever had before, and I just want to pass some of those on. Some of your more technical feedback questions, we actually have answered some of those directly back, but actually some of them I'd like to cover off. First one for Pete, really great topics, and if you have any topics that you'd like us to cover pertaining to Patch Tuesday in the patch management sphere, please send us a little link, send us a comment on the website, and we'll see if we can add those in. We did get a lot of questions on what is the difference between a patch and a vulnerability, and I think I answered this last time, but I just want to re-clarify. A vulnerability is effectively a bug in an operating system or an application. And a patch is something that that vendor creates to fix that vulnerability. And typically what you find is that there are many vulnerabilities, all with a small little update to their operating system or application. And then they bundle them together into a single patch, and that makes that patch efficient. That's generally called like a roll-up type patch. Just because we are saying there are 100 vulnerabilities doesn't necessarily mean there are 100 patches, so don't worry about it. There's not that there isn't that many to actually deploy. What it does mean though is the patches are larger. So when we say it's a large list of vulnerabilities this month, it means the patches are larger, and if the patches are larger, it takes longer to deploy across your network, and obviously it takes longer to install. So that's why we highlight what some of the more important vulnerabilities to target if you don't have the kind of network capacity. The next one is, should I disable Windows Update service? And the answer is absolutely you should not. I'm familiar with websites that say Patch Tuesday is coming, disable Windows Update. The reason why you shouldn't disable the service, actually two reasons. The first one is just because you're not looking for vulnerabilities doesn't mean you're not vulnerable for them. And secondly, even though you do want to install an update, if that service is disabled, the patch won't actually install. And the patch error code that you get won't be the service is disabled, it will just be an unglamorous error message that doesn't mean anything, so it's really difficult to troubleshoot. So if you are at a pinch and you want to leave time for Microsoft to test and for the community to test patches prior to you doing the installation, set your services to manual and then allow your product, your your Windows Update services to do the patching when it's convenient for you. If you need help with a strategy, when we get to the website, you'll see where you can send us a message and we can give you a PDF to help you. Your Windows feature update. We actually had a small error on the Windows feature update page. Actually, one of the Windows feature updates was already expired and we hadn't marked it red. So I do apologize. Thank you for that feedback. We like good and bad. What we're actually doing though is we're adding in what is near expiry as well as a color. So you'll see what is expired in red and what is coming to expiry in gold. So that's some of the feedback that we had. I really appreciate all of the comments. You can actually submit those through Facebook, through our website, or actually just send us an email. Okay, so let's take a look at some of the release cadence for this Patch Tuesday. And if you've been with us before, you realize that Patch Tuesday actually happens more than once a month. So last week we had 5 non-security Office updates for Office 2016, Project 2016, Skype 2016, and Office and PowerPoint version 10. And those are non-security vulnerabilities, but they are reliability and product enhancements. So we do recommend that you include that in a deployment strategy should you have those versions. There was 120 security fixes. And I'm going to touch on this again because the cadence for the last 6 months, we've now surpassed completely all of the security fixes that were released by Microsoft last year. We're only in August. So I actually imagine there's actually some records to be set this year. But I actually want to talk about those security fixes in a lot more detail when we get to that part of the webinar. And the third Patch Tuesday, which actually is next week, is reserved for the .NET framework. And once again, these are quality and reliability improvements. Now, we don't know what's coming next week, but we know that last month they actually released 3 of these for Windows 10. So we had .NET Framework 3.5, 4.8 for Windows 10 feature update 1903 and 1909. We also had .NET Framework 3.5, 4.7.2 for 1809, which is coming to end of life really soon. And lastly, 4.8 for 1809 as well. Those are coming to end of life. We're going to cover those in a little bit more detail. You have a few months before you do need to react. But we're going to cover those in more detail later on. We also have an advisory. So we don't have an out of band, but this is something new based on feedback from a previous webinar we had, is to bring through the advisories. Now the advisories are a little bit different. So advisories are where a patch necessarily isn't available. There is a vulnerability. This one is advisory 200011. This is known as boot in the hole. Is that right? It's a funny name. It's to do with the secure boot on your device. And actually, this has fallen into the Linux world as well. So even if you have this particular application, you do need to configure the operating system and specifically the UEFI on the device. It is quite a lengthy procedure. There's a few things you need to do. So that is the website to go to find out the exact steps to implement in order to resolve that. Traditionally, these aren't patches necessarily. So if you had a vulnerability scanning solution or security solution, typically that is where you'll find the steps to resolve that issue. And it does, in fact, resolve an awful lot of CVEs. So there's a lot of CVEs resolved by this. It's very important that you do take this into consideration if you do have that particular software installed and that particular hard drive encryption. So, John, you've done some research into some third-party updates for us.
Yep, absolutely.
Yep.
Appreciate it, Rob. As I've said in the past, third-party updates are just as important as operating system updates to remedy those potential vulnerabilities. Since last month, additional updates have been released to resolve these major vulnerabilities. First, as pretty normal, Adobe has patched a number of critical and important severity flaws related to 26 different CVEs within Acrobat and Reader for both Windows and Mac OS. Similar to what Rob had mentioned earlier, the number of vulnerabilities doesn't really match the number of updates. In this case, they're just a couple of updates, but of course, there are 26 different vulnerabilities. 11 of these vulnerabilities are rated as critical, so if exploited, it could lead to arbitrary code execution in the context of the current user per Adobe's website. They do recommend all users update their installations to the latest versions as soon as possible. Also, within the past 2 months, Adobe has released additional patches later in the month, a little bit different, so it'll be interesting to see if that trend continues for them. Another one, TeamViewer did release a statement a few weeks ago, as well as new updates for versions 8 through 15. So if you're on any version of TeamViewer, you should be updating to address a vulnerability in custom URI handlers on desktop versions of Windows. This particular flaw does have a CVSS rating of 8.8 with high severity. It should be noted, though, that although this vulnerability does have a high rating, I was able to see that the researcher had discovered it has mentioned the chances of exploitation are low as the attack is challenging and does require user interaction, but in either case, if you are using TeamViewer, be sure to update all clients to the latest versions as soon as possible as well. Both Mozilla Firefox and Thunderbird were patched for some moderate and high severity vulnerabilities. This is pretty routine as well, considering the amount of clients, customers that they do have. Firefox version 79 was actually released on July 28th and did include additional web render support for better graphics performance. It also included a number of other high and moderate severity fixes ranging from resolving memory safety bugs to extension APIs and WebRTC. Thunderbird version 78 was actually released mid last month. So previously on the previous call, we actually mentioned 68. So this is actually a new client version as well. Since then, mid last month, they've actually released a few additional updates. So 78.1, 78.1.1. The latest version does resolve similar vulnerabilities to Firefox, so won't get into those too much detail. It's near similar framework. But it does also include a number of new visual features since it is a new version and supports OpenPGP. I did see on their website, though, that OpenPGP is now in a completed state. However, it's still disabled by default. So if that's something you're after, it is going to be disabled. You can turn it on, but they're leaving it disabled for everyone just to allow for some more time for testing since it is brand new. If you are using a previous version, you will need to download the new version from their website. You cannot update if you have an old version of Thunderbird. But a newer release of Thunderbird will provide some updates from the earlier versions. Did also see that from their website, Thunderbird only supports mail extensions. So it's another thing to note if it's a client that you use. Last but not least, Foxit Reader released version 10.0.1 to address multiple high severity vulnerabilities. Another case in which there are many vulnerabilities, but only one update, as well as they did resolve some stability issues. One particular CVE, though, does have a base score of 8.8. So if anyone is also using Foxit Reader, or as I see Phantom PDF as well, should update as soon as possible. Some additional third-party products to also note that have seen some updates, but not to note any particular severity from the vendor or from the industry. Adobe Flash Player, Cisco WebEx, Microsoft Edge, Dropbox, iTunes, Opera, WinSCP, as well as Zoom, which is very commonly used these days. So just another reminder to all administrators, always include third-party patching in your patch management process, but also to consumers. Don't defer the third-party updates. Make sure that if there is an update available for any product, go ahead and allow it.
That's brilliant, John. Thank you very much. That's very good. Thank you. Okay, so this month, Pete has chosen a very complicated, for me, it was a very complicated concept of something called patch supersedence. And I think it's incredibly valuable. And I've got lots of questions, and we actually are going to set up a poll at the end of this particular topic there. I have a very important question I'd like to ask. So Pete, maybe you'd like to let us know what you've been working on.
Yeah, no problem at all, Rob. Okay, so can we just move on one slide, please, Rob? Thanks very much. Okay, so by understanding patch supersedence, it's possible to fully patch your estate whilst at the same time deploying fewer patches than might appear required at first glance. Basically, a patch is said to be superseded when the vendor of that patch releases a newer patch to replace that older patch. Now, there are several reasons why a vendor might do this. I've listed a few of those reasons in the slide being shown at the moment. The reasons may be down to efficiency, or the fact that more changes are actually required to fully remediate that vulnerability, or even due to the fact that additional but related vulnerabilities have also been found, and therefore it requires an update to that patch to fix those vulnerabilities. A patch will have at least one component, but many patches really have several more components, generally for different operating systems and things like that. Now, if some but not all of those components have been superseded, then the patch is basically said to be partially superseded. It's also worth noting that the supersedence chain can be many, many patches deep, literally up to 10 patches deep, although maybe 2 or 3 being more the norm. Next slide, please, Rob. Okay, thanks. So here we have a couple of examples. Did take them out of our console, and why not? So you can see here in the first example that the patch named KB4475539 has 2 components, so fairly simple. And those components have both been superseded by the patch named KB4484167. In the second example, we can see here that there's a patch named MS15080V2. Has a total of 6 components, but only 2 of them have been superseded by KB4503292. Next slide, please, Rob. Okay, so why is it important to know about these superseded patches? Actually, I think we've gone slightly wrong here. There should be a graph here, Rob, actually.
Have you that's on the next one.
Oh, okay, I do apologize then. Okay, so what does all of this mean? Well, basically, earlier as I mentioned earlier, we can deploy 1 patch rather than 2 patches to remediate a vulnerability. We're creating less network traffic. We're reducing the risk of disturbing the end user. And obviously, and I think I've mentioned this in the past, there is a risk in deploying patches to devices. So the less patches we can actually deploy to devices while keeping them those vulnerabilities down, then the less likelihood there is of doing any damage to a patch. Okay, in simple terms, if we deploy an old patch, the device will still be vulnerable and will require the new patch. But if we deploy the newer patch, then the device will be fully remediated and the old patch will not be required to be installed. Okay, next slide, please, Rob. Okay, yep, you're right. Here's the slide. Okay, so in this graph here, we can see basically efficiency. Now, this was taken from real-world statistics. That's a hard word for me to say. From one of our customers, and you can see here that the month on month, the average number of missing patches per device when we include or exclude superseded patches. And obviously, if we can exclude the superseded patches, then the devices appear to be less vulnerable, and truly are less vulnerable as long as we actually deploy those superseding patches. Next slide, please, Rob. Okay, so how can my deployment tool actually help me? Well, in order to use this knowledge that we now have, the patch deployment tool that we are using must give us reliable information with regard to patch supersedence. As a bare minimum, it needs to at least indicate whether a patch has become partially or fully superseded. Having said that, if the tool can do more than that, then we can take advantage of this. So if the tool can automatically filter patches based on this information, we can go a stage further and create automatic patch deployment processes that can filter out the superseded patches and even replace those with the superseding patches. And even actually moving further on from that, if the tool has the capability of using extra filters, such as the CVSS or vendor severity or patch type or publish date, then we can also build this into our deployment tool to therefore build a automatic patch deployment process that really fulfills our requirements and suits our needs. Okay, Rob, next slide, please. Okay, so I thought I'd just put this in as well. The cumulative patches are not really being classed as superseding patches, though technically they are actually doing this. So basically, a cumulative patch is a patch that is replacing many previous patches that may not even relate to each other. They may all be fixing different vulnerabilities, but Microsoft has decided to lump them all together into one large patch and call it a cumulative patch. Now, there are some actual issues that we've spotted with these patches, and our current concern with regards to these patches is that at the moment, Microsoft don't seem to have made their minds up with regards to how to score these patches with a severity rating. In fact, some of these patches are being released with no rating whatsoever, although the patches that they are replacing may have several ratings going from critical all the way down to NA. Now, this is something that here at Syxsense that we're quite concerned about, and we're actually working on ways in which our product can actually at least give our customers some form of indication as to the importance of these cumulative patches. But all I can say for that at the moment is watch this space. We're still working on that. And as soon as we've got something in place, it'll be within our product.
That's brilliant, Pete. Thank you. That's such a fascinating topic for me. So I have a question. I think we've got 70, almost 80 people watching. I'm sort of interested, what is more important for your reporting? So specifically, if you're an IT engineer, an IT director, or you work for an MSP, what is more important? Is it the number of patches that you deployed, or is it the number of patches still remaining on the device? So do you show in your reports we've deployed 100,000 patches, or is it how many patches still need to be deployed? And that's really important, because if you've taken into consideration the patch supersedence, you may have actually deployed patches that aren't really needed. And so depending on your answer, we'll actually review that and actually come up with the results in the next one.
Rob, can I just say it's highly unfair that you're not letting me vote on that? I've noticed at the bottom.
I don't think we can be, sorry.
Oh, okay.
Okay, so far, that means patches so far, so still remaining so far on your device. Okay, now as Pete mentioned, we have a scoring system. This is how we feel we can prioritize and rank vulnerabilities each based on 6 of these factors. The first one is the vendor severity. So the vendor severity comes from the vendor and typically is from critical, high, medium, low, and NA. Now actually this is a bit complex because not all vendors use critical, medium, critical, high, medium, low. Some actually use important. It's very important. It's sometimes challenging to understand where different vendors use different severity for their vulnerabilities. Then we have the independent CVSS score, and that's a standard. That's what we've been learning for several months now, where Pete's been running across the CVSS. It's an independent scoring system, and effectively is critical, important, all the way down to NA. But it is independently ranked, and interestingly enough, there are many ways to create a score that's based on a real life scenario, and that means that real life scenario could in fact change. We have weaponization. So if a vulnerability is being weaponized, and there may be some in this Patch Tuesday release to be aware of, weaponized vulnerabilities is where the bug is being actively exploited by something. Could be a malware, could be a virus, it could be a hack. Weaponized vulnerabilities don't necessarily have a critical severity, so you do need to be aware. Weaponized vulnerability is actually quite hard to find, so we do have a team looking for vulnerabilities that are weaponized. And these typically are where you find 0 day. So anything that is currently being weaponized, we would class as a 0 day vulnerability. Public aware is in 2 types. You've got public aware where a patch exists, and you've got public aware where a patch does not exist. And a public aware means that the code, the bug itself, has been made public. Typically, these come via bug bounty programs. Now, if you let your fingers do the walking, you can find on websites what bugs exist in operating systems and applications, and you could potentially, if you were a hacker, write some code to exploit it. If you have a patch available, you can deploy the patch to resolve the vulnerability. If you don't have a patch available, that is where a security tool or a vulnerability scanning tool would come in. It would scan your machines and look for where these bugs exist, so you can close the vulnerability off from actually getting exposed. Countermeasures are what is again in 2 parts. Countermeasures are friends. You have mitigations. So mitigations, for example, you have a sophisticated antivirus product protecting your devices. If that antivirus can protect your machine, then you have a countermeasure, and you don't necessarily need to prioritize as much the vulnerability itself. But you also could have one of those security scanning solutions. If you have one of those, maybe you've already found the problem and already taken steps to resolve it. And then the second is a workaround. So like in the last Patch Tuesday, we had a workaround where you could set the registry key and stop and start a service. That may be simpler to do than the deployment of a patch, especially in a highly distributed workforce. You could also introduce group policy into that as well. So if countermeasures exist, it means you have something you can do and not rely on the patch itself. Now we put all that together and we wrap it into your current exposure. So when we go through the vulnerabilities, if you have the CVE capability within your patch management tool, you can search for your exposure and compare them against our recommendations that we're going to go through next, and you'll see which ones you should be deploying absolutely urgently to your environment. So those are the 6 ways that we rank and prioritize every single vulnerability that is resolved by a patch. So what we're going to do, we don't have the actual Patch Tuesday list in this slide deck. We actually have it up on our website. So if you can pop over to Syxsense.com, you actually see on the news page up here, we have a dedicated holding page for Patch Tuesday. And if you click on news, you can see other articles that in fact we've published as well. If you have questions, you can talk to our techies in the corner, or if you want to download a patching strategy, or even start a trial, if that's what you'd like, to do that scanning your environment, you can do so from there. But down here we have all of the pages, all of the articles that we publish. We do a lot of vulnerability information research, and we put everything here to help keep your environment safe. We're going to look at the August Patch Tuesday page right now, and just to remember, this site is live every single Patch Tuesday, and if you don't want to remember to go to it, then you can fill in your details here, click subscribe, and you'll get a link every single month. Okay, so let's take a little look. So yesterday, as I mentioned, there was 120 vulnerabilities, some of them very scary, 17 critical, which is not massive critical vulnerabilities resolved yesterday. But as you'll see, the criticality given by the vendor doesn't necessarily match to the urgency in which you should deploy the patches that resolve those vulnerabilities. There was 103 marked important, and as I mentioned right at the start, we've now released, or they have now released or fixed more bugs than the whole of 2019, and I suspect that they're going to double it by the end of this year. just because of the feature roadmap, feature update roadmap that we're going to see in a second. Now, we do have a lot of clients still using Windows 7 and 2008. It was officially ended in January, but there are 52 vulnerabilities fixed for Windows 7 and 41 vulnerabilities fixed for Server 2008. And if you can see, some of them are very, very important as well to install. So if you have those and you do have the extension that's called ESU, Extended Support Agreement, you can get access to those via Syxsense, or you can actually get access to your patches from the device. It needs a special license. Okay, so let's take a little look about some of the top patches that that we're going to highlight today. So when I was going through this list yesterday, I was using the 6 factors in order to rank them. And the last one is actually quite surprising. So we're going to talk about the first one first. So 1380. This is actually an Internet Explorer vulnerability. Those of you that are still using Internet Explorer. It's critically rated and it's weaponized. So it's currently out there and it's being used to exploit your environment. There are no countermeasures, so you have to deploy this patch to your remote workforce. And it actually affects every single Microsoft operating system. So you really need to ensure that everything from your desktops to your servers are patched with this. And based on the CVSS, the weaponized status, and the vendor severity, with no workaround, this should be considered our #1 pick for today. And because of its weaponized status, we believe it should be considered 0 day. Our next one is 1464. This is only rated important, but based on the 6 factors that we used on the previous on the slide deck, it's weaponized and it's public aware. So the two together is like a nightmare. It is, however, less likely to be used. So if you look at the vulnerability itself, it is less likely, but that doesn't mean that it's not going to be used to expose an environment. This actually affects the security features of every single Windows OS and how it sees signed files on the system. So if you can actually expose this vulnerability and put a file onto the system, Windows can actually use it and not recognize it as actually not being a properly signed program, and it could cause the system to crash, be unstable, and obviously end user disruption is really a nightmare right now, especially with everybody trying to work from home. Your central servers and those desktops are more important than they've ever been before. And also, this should be considered a 0 day vulnerability as well. And the last one is actually a CVE 1585. Now, the reason why I've chosen this, although it is the CVSS score, well, it was the highest rated CVSS score of the bunch, it's my 3rd pick today because only a month ago we released a out-of-band update for Windows codec library vulnerability that was actually weaponized, and it was fixed by Windows as a 0 day vulnerability. And this is super similar to that particular vulnerability. So based on what has happened before, as I understand, our expert experience says that hackers are using both new and established ways to get into networks and devices. So there's absolutely no reason why not to prioritize this one, even though Microsoft says that it is probably less likely to actually be used to expose an environment. I don't feel that should devalue that vulnerability at all. So we have also listed everything down here with 5 elements of the scoring system. Obviously, the exposure is down to you in your tool set. But I have asked John and Pete to have a look to see what they might also prioritize in this release. And I think, John, you have one that you'd like us to take a look at.
Yeah. I chose one yesterday and actually became more interesting today in the last few hours. This is for CVE 2020-1472, net logon elevation of privilege vulnerability with initially a high severity rating and a CVSS score of 8.8, but has since been independently scored and increased, or I apologize, a vendor score of 8.8, and has now been independently scored and increased to a critical rating with a CVSS score of 10. That's the one. Yeah. This vulnerability exists when an attacker establishes a vulnerable net logon secure channel connection to a domain controller using the net logon remote protocol. To exploit this vulnerability, according to Microsoft, an unauthenticated attacker would be required to use the net logon remote protocol to connect to a domain controller to obtain domain administrator access. Interestingly, Microsoft is addressing the vulnerability in a phased two-part rollout. So part one, with the recently released updates, will protect the Windows devices by default, log the proper events, and allow the option for protection with explicit exceptions. The second phase of Windows updates will become available in Q1 of 2021. Customers will be notified via a revision to this security vulnerability. And this phase will instead place domain controllers in enforcement mode, which requires all Windows and non-Windows devices to use secure RPC via NetLogon, or to explicitly allow the account by adding an exception for any non-compliant device. So pretty interesting one, considering it's a two-part rollout.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Thank you, John. We actually should keep an eye on that one and actually maybe put something in a future webinar when the second part becomes active, because I think that's, it doesn't get CVSS score 10 for any reason. It must be based on the real life scenario of actually that becoming a future weaponized vulnerability. Yeah, that's brilliant. Thank you, John. And Pete, you've got one for us as well.
Yep, I've found one that I think is quite interesting. I don't think it has had its score changed. So this is CVE 2020-1587. So it's classed as important by the CVSS scoring system and with an actual score of 7.8. Basically, this patch is to do with the WinSock interface. And just to be clear here, so anytime an application is accessing your network or the internet, it is using this WinSock interface, and as such, therefore, it's a very important part of the operating system, and you want to make sure that that's secure. Basically, WinSock provides this interface for different versions of the Windows operating system. Mac does have a similar interface for their computers. WinSock was first introduced with Windows 95 and it became part of the operating system, but earlier versions of that, the actual program had to be installed. But I think that's one that could sneak under the radar, basically. It's a very important part of the OS, and therefore you want to make sure that it's just as secure as possible.
Yeah, I do remember WinSock. I was around in the Windows 95 days. Yeah. Right, that's brilliant.
Giving your age away there, Rob.
Yeah.
You're only 10.
Okay, so those are our selections. So there's our five picks for today. They may not all be resolved inside a single patch, so you do need to take a look at your tool set to help you. But those are our everything in yes in this column is what we're effectively suggesting is that they're the ones that should be absolutely prioritized. You can export this list and put it into an Excel document should you need it. Okay, so let's look at let's take a little look at some issues. Now, we personally haven't found these, and I mentioned in the last webinar that my patch management team do a lot of system tests when Microsoft release their patches, plus also third-party vendors as well. And we test a lot of operating systems that our clients have. So the flavors of Windows, feature updates, they're all inside a lab of ours. When we see an issue, we will bring that to you. We will let you know that there is an issue that we have personally found. Now, these issues I have not personally found, but somebody was very kind enough to actually send me these prior, because they're actually documented on the Microsoft site. So if you're using Windows 7 and Windows 2008, you could get this error here. Actually, I think this was because somebody was downloading, installing this patch that didn't have that extended service agreement. So if you do try to install an update where you don't have a valid license, it will actually roll back on the reboot. So you'll deploy it, it will let you install it, and then it will roll back on the reboot. And the more updates that you install, the longer it will take to roll it back. And those are some of the more dangerous kinds of operations you can do on Windows, and that's actually to uninstall. That's why testing is absolutely key. And then certain operations may fail on clustered shared volumes. So if you have a 2008 server and you are using clustered shared volumes, extra testing should be performed. And then lastly, for Windows 10, one for 1809 and 2004 feature update. Devices with some Asian language packs installed may get that error, or the web page may not actually work. You may actually go to a web page and Microsoft Edge actually reports that there's an error accessing the page itself when that page is using non-standard ports. Our recommendation would be to update to the newest Chromium-based Edge. It's really good. A lot of our clients have already moved there. Or as a workaround, you should uninstall and reinstall any recently installed or updated language packs. That comes directly from Microsoft. And now, if you're on cutting edge 2004, applications like Excel may stop responding on mouse click, hold, and move. So if you're dragging and dropping where you have the Microsoft Input Method Editor for any Chinese or Japanese language packs, if you're moving, dragging, and your system may actually crash, or the application may crash. So those are two. We haven't seen them ourselves. Those are ones that we are aware of. So if you do have any of those environments supported in your environment, extra testing should be considered. And Windows 10 feature updates. John, did you want to just run through this this table for us?
Yeah, as mentioned in some previous webinars as well, this year changed a little bit. So a lot of the previous versions from previous years did change dates in terms of their end of support. Now we have some color coding here. So the dates in red, if you're on any of those versions, make sure that you update as soon as possible, because you actually can't get any actual updates, quality updates that is. Your feature version is unsupported, and as Rob mentioned, they could potentially just get reverted. As you see as well, there are two columns. So they do break it down in terms of consumer OS and enterprise. And there's actually another one Rob will show on the next slide for long-term support. They have a much longer timeline. But these dates are going to be different. Consumers get a much shorter life cycle. There are interim versions too, but as you see, there are actually a lot of interim versions on this page, color-coded in amber. And that's actually a little bit of a concern. So if I were to give a recommendation, I would definitely tell all administrators, move to the latest version. As you see there, a lot of them are paired up to expire just 1 month later. So if you're going version by version, 18 or 1709, let's say, you still have that for enterprise. You move to 1803, you move to 1809. Well, actually, you'll see 1909 or 1903 for enterprise actually expires before, and that's because they gave that a standardized date of December 8th. Overall, I would recommend everyone move to 1909 at least. As you see, it's going to have a much longer support life cycle, regardless if you have a consumer OS or enterprise license.
Yeah, that's brilliant, John. And again, just to ask, if you're using Windows 10 and you have your feature updates deployed, well, what is your strategy? Let us know. If you don't have one, maybe you'd like us to show one as a spotlight on a future webinar. I think that's hugely valuable. I know there's a lot of challenges. The problem is, like John said, if you allow your feature update to expire, then patches will no longer be available for your operating system, and not patching is probably one of the more dangerous places to be. Yeah.
Oh, and long-term support, you do get, well, a longer life cycle, obviously. Do usually come at a heftier price, but it's really just about the quality updates for stability, security as well, but a lot of those optionals, new feature versions are just really not relevant when it comes to a long-term license. So I see they do a much longer support life cycle. If you have the ability to, go for it. They really do allow for an easier method of rolling out and having the your operating system, your devices for much longer extension. As we think, of course, Windows 10 doesn't really have really an end support date. 10 Enterprise long-term for 2019 goes all the way till 2029.
Yeah, that's brilliant. That is a very long time away. So if you do get a chance, if you are able to, I suppose it must be quite a costly exercise. But if you could, then at least you have some stability in your workforce. Okay.
So for Mac operating system, a few things to highlight. There was a new update for Catalina, 10.15.6, CVSS score of, I believe that would come out to high for 7.4, 7.5 for a few CVEs. Security update for Mojave and High Sierra as well, with I believe that's a medium score, correct me if I'm wrong, guys, for 5.3. I'd also like to highlight another vulnerability, although there's not really a patch for it. I just thought it was a very interesting story. Wanted to highlight that last week at Black Hat USA 2020, a security researcher at Jamf was able to run macros without an alert or prompt from the Microsoft Office app that typically prompts for explicit user approval. So when the user opens the document, the macro is automatically executed, and that's of concern. This researcher did warn that although macro-based attacks typically target Windows systems, especially in the past, they are becoming increasingly more common on Mac OS systems. I also thought at the end of this, Apple responded that they had patched these flaws actually well before this, beginning of the year in 10.15.3, it was back in January. As well as they mentioned that this vulnerability doesn't even qualify for CVE, whereas Microsoft responded because it was their application. It's just simply an Apple issue. Just thought that was a little interesting.
Yeah.
Almost like they don't get on with each other.
Yeah.
Few vulnerabilities for Red Hat. Mainly browser-based. You can see here Chromium browser security update, CVSS score of 9.3, so that should definitely be prioritized. Backend security update, 7.9. It's just important, but always want to get to all of those updates. Thunderbird as well. And this goes along with what I had mentioned earlier with third-party updates, of course, released for all platforms that it supports. So there was an update for Thunderbird, and that has actually a vulnerability and result for 9.3, which is critical. And there are actually multiple vulnerabilities for that one. SUSE, infrastructure update, security update for Zen, very important, 9.3, number of vulnerabilities for that. Security update for Perl XML, 9.1, one particular CVE there, as well as a moderate severity for manager client tools. Okay, I see that. Yep. Multiple vulnerabilities for that one, but it does have a very high score. So CVSS of 9.8, even though they, as the vendor, gave it a moderate severity, the industry gave it a much higher score.
Yeah.
And you had mentioned to me in the past, Rob, that SUSE typically is going to go with a lower score for their own updates.
Yeah, it's fascinating how all the other Linux operating systems do sort of have an almost match between their severities and CVSS, and SUSE always seem to be much lower. So,
different sides of the spectrum, yeah.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Ubuntu, a few vulnerabilities as well. Just to highlight some of the scores, not as high as severity from the industry, but as always, goes without saying, definitely prioritize. A few CVSS scores of 7.8, 7.5, 5.0, Squid, Python vulnerabilities, as well as multiple CVEs are referenced here. They also gave their vulnerabilities a medium score. That tends to correlate a little bit more here, although the industry still has gone a little bit higher to give it a higher score.
Yeah. Lastly,
Oracle Enterprise, Thunderbird security update. Of course, it is across platforms, so another Thunderbird update there. Higher score though than any of the others, 9.1 from the industry. They did just simply give it an important severity, but multiple CVEs are referenced. And as I mentioned on Windows, those are just simply higher severity. But in this case, there is potential for more weaponization. Unbreakable Enterprise, kernel security update, that should be actually prioritized. I would recommend that one. Although the score isn't as high, could be a potential issue. And then a security update as well for Fuse. Important as well from Oracle, but 7.8 score. One referenced CVE.
That's brilliant. Thank you, John. Thank you for your research. So we come to the part where we have some questions. If you've submitted, if you haven't submitted any questions, please feel free to do so. It can be about anything you've seen today or anything you'd like us to answer that you have prepared before today, before the session. So Heidi, I guess if there's any questions, I'll hand it to you.
Yeah, absolutely. Great job, guys. There are several questions. The first one is there ever a case when you would want to deploy a superseded patch?
I guess that's aimed at me, since I've been talking about that. I would say, in terms of Microsoft patches, I would say that's very rare that you'd want to deploy a superseded Microsoft patch. Having said that, and I'm sure John, he's a fan of the third-party patches, there could be a case for deploying third-party patches. And in fact, I think this question may have been asked last month, where we did mention superseded patches, but it's a great question, so I'll certainly answer it again. With terms of, say, third-party patches, there could be a situation, and this can happen quite often with the likes of Java and things like that. You may do some testing with Java 8, and the latest patch now, I believe, is 261 for Java 8. You may test that on a few devices and find that it actually breaks an application. Well, rather than not patch those devices at all, if you could test it with the 251, which is now obviously superseded, and you find that that app is still working perfectly well, in my opinion, it would make sense to at least deploy the superseded 251 rather than not to deploy anything at all. So there we go.
Yeah, I completely agree
Very
with
good.
that, Pete. I was always going to say that if you only, in my opinion, you would only install a superseded patch if the one that came after it had problems in your testing. Because any deployment to resolve vulnerabilities is better than nothing.
All right. Next question is, why would a patch have an elevated score one day after release?
In the case of the particular CVE for net logon especially, the original score was from the vendor, and in this case it was from Microsoft. And when the industry was able to take a look at that particular update, basically the score got elevated. As we looked at the 6 areas of rating updates, vulnerabilities overall, there is a difference between the vendor severity and the CVSS, and in many cases, even going through the Linux updates across the different platforms, they're always going to be a little bit different. Be amazed if sometimes they have the same exact score, to be honest.
Right, thank you, JC. This is the last question I have, unless somebody else wants to put it through our questions panel. The question is, does the latest Microsoft release of patches always supersede the previous month's patches?
I think that probably is aimed at me. This is not the case, really. So you can't just deploy the latest or the current month's patches and expect your devices to be fully remediated. It could be that 1 or 2 of those patches are superseding the previous month or even much earlier patches, but you certainly can't take it as the default that you only need to deploy the last month's patches. It's an ongoing situation as Microsoft find, or well, as anyone finds issues and errors, they just continually release newer and newer patches. They don't necessarily all supersede the previous month's patches or supersede any patches whatsoever. Okay.
Also want to point out, sorry.
No, go ahead.
In looking at all the current supported updates, I believe there's still updates for some of the older operating systems, Windows 7, Windows 8, that are still around, and they're near 10 years old.
Yeah, they're not superseded.
Yeah, exactly. So it's not always that the newest slew of updates is going to update everything in the past. Just go with the newest. There are clearly still updates. They're very old, but are still technically current.
And there's a lot for .NET Framework as well. You see, the patch itself may only change a few DLLs, and the next patch that they release may change a few different DLLs. So you may actually still need to deploy both.
There was one other thing I wanted to bring up, Rob. It's just you mentioned earlier on about your testing team testing patches before they put them into the Syxsense console. I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, that your team has actually found issues with patches and refused to put them into our console. And then we've actually had customers saying, "Hey, why isn't this patch actually in the console?" And a member of your team has had to sort of say, "Well, there is an issue with that patch. You wait and see. Within a couple of days, Microsoft are going to pull that patch and bring out a V1 or a V2 version of it." So yeah, I think that's happened several times, hasn't it? To be honest.
I don't remember it happening this year, but actually last year there were several updates actually that crashed the operating system. And what I think we can cover off testing in a future webinar, because it's a fascinating topic. We've developed some highly intelligent testing practices here, but actually not only are you testing the patches individually, but when you put your patches together and you deploy lots of patches together, that's where you typically find patches interact with other patches, and patches need patched. It's a strange concept, but typically when you have a patch that has an issue like that, we are in that testing able to find those issues. And actually, if we did, we're going to bring it straight to you in the webinar. So yeah, cheers for that, Pete. Yeah, it's great.
Yeah, no props.
Very good. Great info. Yeah, do you want to close this up, Rob?
Yeah, so thank you very much for joining us today. I know we've got a few minutes left. Please let us know if the time we know your time is very, very precious. And let us know if the time is good. Let us know if there's anything more you'd like us to add or remove from the topics. And we really wish you the best. Everyone is safe. And if you do go to the website and you would like to talk to us about a strategy, there's a chat, or you can download any of the white papers from the page. Thank you very much, and I hope you have a great week.
Okay, bye, everyone.
Thanks all. Goodbye.